Okay, so I ran into a performance issue the other day, one of those frustrating ones where a component kept re-rendering for no obvious reason. Nothing changed, prop looks the same, state looked the same, but React Native just kept re-rendering the component. Turns out it was one of those situations where a memo, useMemo, and useCallback are supposed to save the day if you use them right. I've actually hit this issue twice. The first time was in my first year as a professional developer, and the second was just like last month in my fourth year. Same problem and same solution. And before I show you the real problem I faced, I want to walk you through how these three APIs behave. I've put together a simple component to demonstrate how memo, useMemo, and useCallback actually work in practice. Here is my expose next. I have created a simple component that contains an image, several text components, and a counter. This counter will go up if the component re-render, which will be toggled by this button. If we look at the component itself, it's pretty simple. It's just a plain component from React Native. We have image, text, and the counter itself is coming from a useref. Now let's try to toggle a state to see whether the component is re-rendered or not. So whenever the light state change, this component will re-render. Now maybe there is a time when you don't want this component to re-render just because the state doesn't have anything to do with the component itself. So here I already created a component that leverage memo API from React. So you just need to import the memo from React and wrap your component with the memo itself. And let's see in practice how this behave. And I forgot to mention that you can see the name of the component that is being presented here. So we are right now testing a plain component with memo. So I can change the state here. As you can see, the component is not being re-rendered anytime the light state is changing, which is great. It's the first use case where the memo is really pretty straightforward for the usage, but when it comes to a more complex situation, maybe you can get confused just like I did. And now I'm going to show you what happens if we decided to create a component that receives props. And here I created a component called card primitive that accepts several props in primitive type. So just a simple string and number, and I just pass it to our component here, nothing fancy, and wrap it with memo, just the same. Now I'm using the card primitive component, as you can see here, and I already passed several props in primitive type, and let's see what happened. So memo still works, it still memoizes the component. The state changes doesn't affect our component to be re-rendered multiple times unnecessarily. But there's a time when you pass a reference type as a prop, such as an object or array, which is a normal thing to do in React. Here I created a component that receives food as a prop, which contains name and image properties, so it's an object. We pass the prop as usual. Put the image and photo name, nothing fancy still. You wrap it in memo. Let's see in action how this practice breaks our memoization. The memo API is no longer working. It keeps rendering the same component even though prop doesn't change. Here I'm going back to our card reference component. And actually memo has a second parameters that you can use. If you hover over the memo, you can see that it receives props are equal. It's a function that will be used to determine if the props have changed. If you return a true value, it means that the component doesn't have to be rendered. Here I pass a second function. The second parameter gives us previous props and next props, and then we can compare it manually. Maybe here I just care about food object for the name and image properties. So in here I compare both of them. So as long as this value is true, then the component doesn't need to be rendered. False, then it needs to be rendered. If we try to change the state again, our memoization works again. So that is the first unique case when we use memo API. And now let's go back to our previous component where we only receive food name and food image as a string, not an object. But this time we have a new prop called promotion. It's an object, has type and value properties in string and number, but I'd like to think that it is an object that is not coming from the food itself. So maybe it's like something bigger or a parent. Maybe the promotion coming from the store or a region instead of the food itself. So it's like general props for several foods that is available. Here is how we use the component called cart useMemo. So everything is a primitive type prop, anything related with the food itself, but let's say that this prop is coming from the parent based on something outside the food entity itself. I call it promotion, so it has type as a percentage and value as 20. As you know before, if we pass a reference type prop to a component that is being wrapped by a memo, the memoization will not work. So the component keeps being re-rendered. So how do we handle this? Well, let's say that you have the promotion itself coming from maybe an API or something. Now, in order to memoize a value like this, an object, there's a API called useMemo. We receive a function that returns any type of value. We are just gonna return a promotion here, and it also has a second param called dependency list. It's just the same as useEffect. So for example purposes, I'm just gonna pass an empty array. So how do we make this work again? Well, there's a API called useMemo. So instead of memoizing a component, useMemo any type of value, which is exactly what we need since we want to memoize an object. So let's try to use this API. We can call this promotion useMemo, receive a function that returns any type of value. So I'm just gonna return our promotion here. And the second parameter, actually a dependency array, just like useEffect. Right now I'm just going to use an empty array, and let's replace this with our useMemo value. Now let's try to change the state again. Great, now the memoization still works. So that is the second unique use case where your component can be re-rendered multiple times just because you pass a reference type. And the second solution for that is that using a useMemo API instead of the second function of a memo API. So that is an alternative for you. If we look at the cart useMemo component, which is the one that we are using right now, I'm not using a second parameter of memo API. We are just using the behavior of useMemo API itself, where it memoizes a value. Now, what happens if you want to pass a function to a component? Let's say that I want to pass a onPress prop to this component. Maybe you can navigate me to a new page or something. And if we look at the component itself, I receive a prop called onPress, which is a function that returns nothing. So we try to change the state, the memoization will break again. And this is where useCallback shines. This is the third APIs that we are talking today. So let's say we create a variable called onPress and we use useCallback here coming from our React, and it's just the same as useMemo, but instead of returning a value, it returns a function. And it also receives a dependency array right now, which is empty. And maybe you can, and now you can move anything that you have here to our useCallback and just replace this with our useCallback. Now try to change that again. The memoization will work again. So to summarize, if you are already wrap your component with memo API, there is a thing that can break your memoization. That is when you try to pass a reference type as a prop to your component. And one of the solutions that you can use in order to make it work again is by using the second parameter provided by memo API. The second parameter gives you previous props and next props, which later you can manually compare both of them. If it returns true, then the component will not be re-rendered if the parent states are changing. And the second one is by using useMemo API, which receives a function that returns any type of value, and the second parameter is a dependency array, and you can safely pass it to your component, then the memoization will work. If it's not a value, maybe it's a function, then you can use useCallback API to memoize the function itself. Just like what you did with the useMemo, it receives a function and it can return nothing, and the second parameter is just the same, it's a dependency array, and then you can safely use it and then you can pass it to your component and the memoization will still work. That is all. For understanding the behavior of these three APIs, useMemo, useCallback, and memo, by combining these three APIs, you can tackle any performance issue caused by unnecessary re-render. In my real-life problem, the state management is more complex. It can coming from API, local state management, or even database, but still, by using these three APIs, I can achieve the same result